Welcome to Part 3 of Chapter 19, Food Resources. We've been discussing in class, you've been working on projects dealing with how industrial agriculture affects, in a negative way, water, soil, air, and biodiversity. And now we're going to look at how do you mitigate this? How do you change what's going on in industrialized agriculture? It's called sustainable agriculture. It is a lower input agriculture where you're using natural fertilizers, so you're using manure, you're using compost, and natural pest controls. Natural pest controls can be anything from using ladybugs to, remember, strip cropping that was done on the hillside. If you use strip cropping, that's also a natural pest control. So we'll discuss that a little bit more. Looking at it from a sustainable point is looking at organic food. These are things not grown with synthetic fertilizers or pesticides or herbicides being sprayed. And utilizing the natural components. So in order for the land to be certified organic so that what's coming off of it, the yields, are considered organic, it takes 3 years with no input of synthetics. And it is anywhere from 5 to 30% more expensive, but that is because the yields are lower on a piece of ground. However, from a farming standpoint, you're getting more per bushel than you would if it was grown in a non-sustainable way. And of course, as probably most of you are aware, organic foods do cost that. They're 5 to 30% more expensive, and so you're paying a lot more for the product. They don't have any antibiotics in them, and there's no growth hormones. And so antibiotics and growth hormones are going to be in your meat products. And these would be free-range animals. They wouldn't be cramped in these pens. Here's a nice picture of a hog confinement operation. Now I put this in here, and they're all the same breed of pig. And notice something else as you look over them, how uniform in size they are. This is one thing with confinement operations and industrialized agriculture. If all these hogs are the same size, then when they do go to slaughter, it's a lot easier to mechanize that process. Same thing with chickens, and same thing with cattle. So there we go with loss of biodiversity. And that works, good for mechanization. For some reason, we're not moving. Just a second. Oops, sorry. Here we go. Now the clicker's back. Okay. This is just a diagram. This is in your book, and it's sustainable agriculture. Basically, here we have a farm where we have multiple crops being grown, and then when we have multiple crops being grown and they're grown in different areas, let me get the clicker on this, with corn, then I can't really tell what that is. That's probably some kind of legume, so or biggery, which would be nitrogen fixing. We have an orchard over here, and then some pine trees over here, This is a shelter belt. These fruit trees also act as a shelter belt as well as produce fruit. These could be cut down for Christmas trees. So what we're looking at here is this farmer has a very varied income. I didn't mean to say very varied, but he has the ability to have different crops coming off at different times, which decreases his need for lots of help one time a year and no other employees other times a year. It also allows him, by diversifying like this, if he loses his corn crop, he still has his other crops that are available to him. And this is really how farming used to be, even when I was a kid. I remember farmers having orchards. I remember them having a couple of different crops and having cattle and hogs. And as I got older, then they were selling their hogs, they were selling their cattle, and they were going more to this format that we already discussed in class and you saw in the 60 Minutes video. When you have a setup like this, and it's not just economically feasible, which I gave, I always give that part to you, but environmentally, what's going to happen here, obviously you can't move the trees. They have to stay where they're at. But his corn and the beans or the berries, he's going to flip-flop those next year. And so the corn will be where those are. And he can even move his cattle. So his cattle don't have to stay on the same pasture. And then maybe the next year, he might put corn where his cows are. Put the beans back, or the berries, I honestly can't tell what those are because they have little red specks in them, and back, so that he has natural fertilization going on. And basically, when you're moving your crops, you're doing it to increase fertility, but it also decreases the likelihood of pests by moving it. If you had corn in the same place year after year, pests that like corn are going to have a nice habitat year after year. So their numbers are going to get higher. But if you move the corn, say, over to where the cows are, then that ground doesn't have any corn borers in it. So the corn's going to be good that year. It'll take a while for the pests to migrate. And that's the idea. That's another thing with crop rotation. Not just increasing the fertility or maintaining the fertility, but also creating a natural pesticide, if you will, by doing that. Another solution, hydroponics. Hydroponics is actually growing in a nutrient bath. It's growing plants. This is common over in parts of Asia and the Middle East because they don't really have areas that are conducive to growing a lot of crops. I watched this on PBS where there was an entire warehouse and they were creating more warehouses complete with grow lights. They had the grow lights and the plants were stacked 2 or 3 stories tall, really. And they were in a conveyor belt that went vertically, and they would go around in a circle, and the plants would come to the bottom and go through a nutrient bath. And that's where they would get their food and their water, and they just kept rotating. And the building is all grow lights, and so then they were growing all kinds of vegetables this way. More than they could if they spread that out on land, which land was very precious, and also low in nutrient level, so they were using this kind of apparatus. Hydroponics are great if you live in an apartment too, because especially if tomatoes or something like that, and you get them to grow vertically, so that they're really not in the way. And so if you have a small space. So this is great for urban living and to give you at least a few vegetables that are high quality that you can use for salads. The last thing we want to cover are fisheries. And we've talked about fish, and I said, you know, 2/3 of the whole world live within 100 miles of the ocean, and fish are an excellent source of protein. So, and an inexpensive source of protein in areas where people are lacking protein. But we have to look at how we fish and what's going on in nature. So I'm taking you all the way back to where we first met in Tragedy of the Commons, where you took your straws and you fished for goldfish. Okay? We were simulating what was going on up in, or what had happened in the Northeast, and this in particular, Georgia's banks, and the cod collapse. Basically, they were overfished, and overfishing caused then a whole collapse in the ecosystem. Then put on top of that, people moving in and industrializing and having lots of pollution coming from the bays where the ships were, where the industry was. It was hard for them to come back. And we discussed how we had to create the Magnuson-Stevenson Fisheries Act and had to revise that in order for that to become strong enough to save the fish. Because, yeah, we had the law, but it wasn't being enforced, and so they put more parameters in, and then made enforcement easier, and did in fact enforce it, and now the populations in that area for fish are coming back. So it's so important to maintain a healthy ocean ecosystem. Some of the things that are really, really bad that fishermen use, drift nets, because the drift nets are pulled behind the boat and they catch on the bottom, and so this tears up the bottom, so this causes sediment to be disturbed, so you get a lot of particulate matter in the water. And we talked about how that already, how that affects gills. We also talked about oysters and how it affects their ability to attach and to colonize. So drift nets definitely are not a good thing. The other thing is a long line, and you can see these hooks are in there. You're catching things that you don't necessarily want to catch with drift nets or with long lines. Most drift nets have to be set up with turtle doors in them, and the turtle doors actually are heavy doors that the big turtles can get out, or a dolphin could get out, but the little fish aren't heavy enough to open it up. So that's supposed to prevent turtles and dolphins from dying. And that would be our bycatch. You know, you're getting things in there that you don't want. And that can hurt the ecosystem as well. The last thing I want to talk about, and we're going to watch this CBS News video. I'm going to take the time out to do that. It's about fish farms. So, anytime you go to the grocery store, you go to Costco, you'll see it on the bag or on the container. It says farmed fish. And these are actually it's like having a feedlot in the water. So you have a very high concentration of fish in one area. It's a monoculture because they're actually using the same DNA, so that all over in all the fishing areas, so that they get fish that are the same size. And what you're going to see on the news clip is they're talking about the salmon. And they've actually used eggs from Atlantic salmon, and that Atlantic salmon, those eggs are all over the world now in these aquaculture farms. And a virus has been transported from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean, because these fish in the Atlantic had this virus, and because they've used these farms, or this breeder species, all over. They've used them in Chile, they've used them up here, and in specifically Canada, which you're going to see on this film is in Canada. And basically now what they're seeing is not just in the farmed fish, but they're starting to see evidence that this is getting into the wild stock. The fear is the wild stock do not have any kind of immunity whatsoever, and it could completely wipe them out. And then there would be no wild fish. So you've got pollution of the water, contamination on the bottom, and disease being acquired from these aquaculture farms. So we will watch that in class. If you'd like to watch it on your own, the website is right down there, right down here on the bottom. So it would be good to do that. This is the Magnuson Fishery Conservation Act, and protects fish habitat, limits catch, and helps to fund rebuilding the species, and that includes creating nurseries and for these fish that are endangered, and then reintroducing them into the wild when they're large enough. These are just graphs that I added in. Wild catch fish and aquaculture production. And we're seeing a huge spike in aquaculture production, and as of 2000, we're seeing a decline in wild catch. So, outcompeting, or is the process that is being used, which is just like a feedlot, just like a confinement operation like you saw those hogs in, is that putting stress on the wild populations? Scientists believe it is so, that wild populations cannot be kept away from these populations because they're all in the same setting. Over here, if you look at this, these are fish pens. So they're actually in the water. They're in a bay area or an estuary area, and they have aeration, so they put air into the water, and they grow the fish. Then they'll put them into a big truck and take them to wherever they process the fish. Just to give you an idea of the types of seafood that are most popular, and many of you know this because since we live close to the ocean, most of us eat some tuna, yellowfin, and salmon, and not many of us eat krill, but shrimp, crabs, and lobster, squid. Octopus is not too famous around here, but you can get it in some places. It's not as good as squid. It tastes a little smoky. Squid's not smoky. That tastes a little smoky. But squid's definitely better. Calamari. that is the end of part 3 and the end of chapter 19, food resources.